Welcome to Listening with China Blue. This is a podcast that focuses on how listening not only informs us about what is occurring in the world around us, but also helps us connect with others, build stronger businesses, strengthens our mental health, and become more creative and compassionate individuals. As more and more people practice attentive listening in a community, it becomes a community-building practice that strengthens our mental health as we learn from our neighbors. I will be interviewing people from all walks of life to learn how listening has informed them in their field and helped them to make intelligent decisions. They will be artists, musicians, composers, dancers, business people, psychologists, neuroscientists, and Buddhists, to name a few. About me, I'm an internationally exhibiting sound-based artist. In my work, Discovering Unheard Sounds, I realized that the core component that drove my work was simply listening. That realization put me on the path of speaking about and helping people learn to become better listeners. I began with leading sound walks, which I continue to do in the upstate New York region to help people learn to listen from nature. And now, tune your ears to this podcast to learn about the power of listening. And do pay attention until the end for further information on how to start your own listening practice, share it with others, and to support listening with China Blue. Today, we are speaking with Richard Humann. Richard Humann is a Brooklyn-based neo-conceptual artist with innumerable international gallery and museum exhibitions, including the Museum of Contemporary Art, the Kemi Art Museum, the Tampere Art Museum, the Youngeun Museum of Art, the Tornio Art Museum, the San Cristóbal Art Museum, Daelim Art Museum, the Macao Art Museum, the Kaohsiung Museum, Ssamzie Space, and Espoo Museum of Modern Art. He has also been included in the 2003 and 2017 Venice Biennale in Venice, in Italy, the Arbitat Biennale in Taiwan, Taehwa River Arts Festival, Ulsan City, in the Republic of Korea, and has represented the United States in the 2017 Karachi Biennale in Karachi, Pakistan. He has also had numerous exhibitions in New York, and you'll have to go to his website to see the lengthy exhibits he's had since Richard Humann has been producing art for, 30 years or more? Since
Many more.
Many more than 30 years.
Yeah. Exactly.
You can read more about him at his website, and I'll give you a link to his website. So, without spending more time talking about what he has done, I would like to speak to Richard Humann, who actually has been a friend of mine for probably 30 years. As an artistic colleague. And I'm excited to speak to him about his approach to listening in relation to his visual art work, which is an interesting combination of topics. So, Richard, here is Richard Humann. Richard, you are a visual artist and have spent your life making and exhibiting art around the world. I'm curious how listening relates to your work that is focused on sculpture, installation, and video work. And welcome, Richard Humann.
Hi, China Blue.
Hey.
Very nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you, Richard?
Very well, thank you. I'm in Brooklyn right now, and you are in Kingston. And as you know, I have a house in Woodstock, just up the road. And the reason I say that is because in relation to your question, I really kind of like have three places that I live, right? So I live in Brooklyn, I live in Woodstock, and then I live on the road traveling. So really, I mean, the traveling is comprised of all the places I go to. But the reason I say that is because in regards to listening, all three of those places are very, very different. And all three of those places are different in how they affect me, how they infuse me with concepts and ideas, and and also how it changes the way I think about things where I am. Like, so when I'm in Brooklyn, and this is directly related to your question on how it, works with my visual art. I'm originally from a small town upstate New York, south of Kingston, but very, very small town, like out of the Andy Griffith Mayberry show, and I'm like Opie Taylor kind of, and it was always quiet and a very small town. And when I came to New York City, you are literally bombarded with sounds, and after a while, you become numb to them, jaded, visually and audio jaded by everything in New York, right? You just are. They always say that New Yorkers don't look up. That's how you know a New Yorker. They're walking in, and I tell people who are visiting, I don't look up, because then they know you're from out of town.
And don't make eye
But it's the same
contact.
with our exactly. But it's the same with our sounds too, because you know recently we've noticed. I live in an old firehouse in Brooklyn. I've been living in this firehouse now for almost 40 years. Crazy enough, it was originally my art studio, which I moved into years ago, and so, and I mean like 38 years ago, and there was this big bump in the middle of the street back then, and that bump is back. They've tried to like fix it. Now, what that means to me is all day long trucks go by carting things in Brooklyn with smashing and banging. And I remember like that was for the first 10 years of my life, and I just completely tuned out to all that thing. I'd have people over and like, what is that? It sounds like a bomb went off down here. I'm like, oh, I don't, what are you talking about? I have no idea. Or when they empty the garbage at 4:30 in the morning in front of the building. I think Larry Miller said he called the garbage trucks like the dinosaurs, Tyrannosaurus Rexes of New York City, because they're like eating these, the short arms lifting up the garbage. But it's noisy, and we are like bombarded by sounds down here. Now, what that does, it actually creates a lot of energy for me. There's this huge amount of energy that I get from New York City. I hate the cars honking, but you know what? It's part of it. The sounds of the subway, the screeching, the this, the yelling. And there's this energy that actually infuses me, to use that word again, with this energy level down here. On the other end of that, Woodstock is a quiet place for me. We have a house on a private road in Woodstock, a couple of acres in the woods, like right in town, but separated. And that's a place to think. So like New York is a place to create and do and energize. Woodstock is a place to contemplate and to get my ideas together. And those are very much related to sound. The sounds around me, the quietness of Woodstock allows me to think and contemplate. Whereas New York, I'm like just in that go mood, just go, go, go mode, I should say. And then the other thing is when you're on the road, the sound of the jet engine, the hum of the 12-hour flight somewhere, or the different languages that you hear and the different sounds of ambulances. And that also is this kind of high energy thing. So I'm very much in tune to sound. And I do a lot with music as well, so I'm very much in tune to it.
So that's really fascinating how sound drives your life and is a part of, is I think you've mentioned to me, kind of the foley of your thoughts and your
Exactly.
life.
Exactly.
Um,
Yes.
and I'm kind of interested in how, or do you see that it invades or influences your creative work, and what might be some examples of that?
Yeah. Again, I one example that comes to mind is I you listed that I was in the 2017 Biennale in Venice, and I created an augmented reality piece that floated over Venice. And I won't go into too much into the detail; it's easily searchable. But so I kind of recreated this star system based on pop culture. And it was just the idea of we look up to the stars and we see Orion and we see Sirius and we see these like the folklore of the ages up there. And I just swapped out that folklore with characters from the 20th century is what it was. And I made backstories from them and, floated this whole entire augmented reality piece over the entire city of Venice for the 2017 Biennale. You could see it from San Giorgio, and you could see it anywhere in Venice. If you looked up with a phone, you could see it. But the reason I say that is I could not have developed that in New York City. I could not have. The epiphany came about by being on my back deck, knowing I was offered this project, knowing we had funding for it, knowing everything was there, curators, exhibition space, the palazzo, the money, everything was there except my idea, right? So I just got offered it because I had been in the art world for a long time and it was presented. But the thing was, I had no idea. And I'm just sitting on the back deck, quiet in Woodstock, looking up at the stars, and instantly the epiphany happened. Just happened. And that would not have happened in New York. First off, we don't see stars in New York, right? And then you're surrounded by
well, you see
getting on the
celebrities.
subway. Exactly. Very good. Very good. Very good. Well done. Well
Thank
done.
you.
But yeah, we see many celebrities and Woodstock now too, to be honest with you, right? But the thing is, like, it's a different approach to art down here. I would not have gotten that particular idea in New York City. It's always on the go here, And anybody who's Korean, please, I apologize for my mispronunciation. But in Seoul, there's like this expression, I think it's like bali bali, meaning like now, everything is now. In New York, everything is now. The sounds, the smashing, the yelling, the cursing. I mean, this morning there was an argument in front of my building. Like every day there's something. And it's not all bad, by the way. It's just part of the soundscape of New York, And Woodstock has a different soundscape. It's the birds, or it's just a different energy that changes who you are and the way that you think. Sound is very important on how it affects us as human beings. Yeah.
Yes. I totally agree with you. And that begs the question of listening. I mean, often we speak about sound as the thing that we listen to, but have you thought about how the actual process of listening leads you in certain directions? What do the sounds inspire? In addition to the loudness or the cacophony of New York versus the solace of Woodstock, would you or could you say that specific experiences are correlated to particular works, for example, or how? Actually, I should not lead you.
You're leading the witness, China.
I know.
Yeah, the answer. The answer is yes, because I'm not just a visual artist, as you know. I do work in sound also. I do work. See, the way that I create art is I have an idea, and then that idea manifests itself in either materials or approach. Meaning, I'm not a painter, but I could paint if my idea is about painting. I've worked on canvas. I started as a painter, but I have an idea, and that idea then, whether it works best on canvas or paper or in bronze or in, I've cast army men from baby aspirin, right? So the idea was there. So the material basically is a follow-up to the concept. It's not necessarily, I don't work in a material and then push paint around on a canvas. It's amazing that people do that, and I'm amazed and appreciative of it. But so for me, I've also worked in sound, many times, and so I'm actually doing a sound piece right now, and the sound piece is based on the Nietzsche piece, Eternal Return. It's the idea of, like you living your life over and over and over and over again. Exactly, right? And the reason I say this is I'm not one to always like draw from Nietzsche. Sometimes I could draw from a cartoon. It doesn't have to be this highbrow Nietzsche thing, but I got fascinated by, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And it just fits into my whole thing right now. And I'm doing a sound piece based on that. And so it's really allowed me to think about how sound has affected my life. The concept is it's a 20-minute long sound piece that's printed on vinyl that plays over and over and over. When the 20 minutes are over, the needle comes back and eventually eats into the plastic. So eventually the piece will destroy itself over and over. And every time after 500 plays, the quality will start to degrade. And you know, and that's the whole idea of it in a nutshell. But it has forced me to think about how sound, taking in a whole entire life in a 20-minute sound piece, how is that possible? What are the sounds of my life? And so yes, really, for the past 2 or 3 months since I've been on this, you know, eternal return or endless return, if I call it, I haven't titled it yet, has made me think about how sound has been not just a backdrop of my life, but now it's pushing it to the forefront of my life. So it's not just the Foley sounds, or it's not me walking, you know, or on the subway going on the L train to 14th Street with my headphone in listening to music. Now sound is the forefront of my life because of this art piece. And it's a journey to cross that border between background and foreground for me. A
Right,
conscious effort to do so.
right, right. That's really a fascinating example um, that of a work that you're working on, and it's
Yeah.
interesting to understand how it's in progress. One of the things that I often think about is how people are introduced to art once it's finished, and they're not involved in the process, and they're not exposed to the nuances and the dramas and all of the sagas that we as artists experience.
Agreed. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
hearing you speak about your process and what you're engaged in and the questions that it brings up creates for a very fascinating a story about one person's process of making in relationship to a very specific work. And what I'm finding is really interesting about this is that not only is your interest in and preoccupation with listening to sounds around you and being highly attentive to the audioscape that surrounds you wherever you are in the world, but also this work that you're speaking about, whatever it's going to be called, endless return possibly.
Yeah,
uh,
I'm not sure. Yeah.
uh, it it proposes creating a listening experience for others. Now, the way I see it is that it creates. If you were to play this vinyl over and over and over again for 20 minutes, in perpetuity, until
Yeah.
it completely dies. I was thinking about the person who would be doing that and listening to it, and what you're creating is an experience for others to be a part of a process that is not only the process of the work in making, as I had mentioned before, but the process of the work in dying.
It's exactly correct. It's you'd be listening to the, let's call it, the protagonist of the story, whomever that is in that 20-minute section. So you'd be listening to the birth and death of that person within the realm of the, you know, the concept of that. But on the other hand, you're also listening to the fading of the lives in the future. Like each time that life happens, it fades a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And then after 500 plays, it degrades a lot. And then 1,000, it's more. And then 10,000, maybe it's eating into the vinyl itself. So you're hearing, literally, you're hearing the composition, not the musical composition, but the composition of the vinyl material itself. It's playing that instead of the groove of the record itself. So I'm fascinated to find out what that sounds like mixed in with the cut groove of the sound piece when you actually are cutting into the deep vinyl past that groove is what for me that would be interesting.
Oh
Yeah.
my. I'm putting on my science hat and thinking, oh, how can we research what that will not only not I don't know if anybody has done anything on what that might sound like, but I'm curious about how long it will take to get to that point. I mean, do you have to have a specific kind of a needle?
I know.
Maybe the needle will wear down before the vinyl. Who knows, right?
Well, it's a good question, and the answer is probably yes, to be honest with you. And I have to make decisions like that as an artist. Do I replace the needle or do I not replace the needle? I don't know. So these are things that come up, right? So I'm not sure yet. Do I print both sides of this? If I'm printing both sides of the album with something else on the other side, will it go through and we start hearing the B side of the record through the other piece?
No, the B
So
side
these are
in
all things that I don't know.
reverse.
Exactly. Very Beatlesque or Pink Floyd, right? And speaking of Beatles, I mean, probably the closest I've had is, playing out the Beatles' White Album when I was in college over and over and over again. I should go back and study my old White Album and see how deep the groove went.
Yeah.
Because I think I played that through my entire my college years. But these are questions we have to ask. And also, it's funny enough, without going off on a tangent, as a conceptual artist, which you are as well, we have to ask these questions: at which point is scientific and which point is poetic, right? So the poetic thing is, well, do I really need to keep the needle there? Can I switch that needle out because it's going to dig deeper into the vinyl? Which is the poetry part of that? Which is the conceptual part of it? And then the scientists would say, no, maybe you don't ever touch the needle. And then you're finding out the wearing of the needle and finding out the wearing of the vinyl. So to me, I'm more of the poetic type, right? Prosaic and poetic, as opposed to scientific. Yes.
Of course.
And then these are things you just have to figure out.
Right. And that's really, I'm glad you vocalized that particular nuance about decision making as an artist, because, as you know, my past husband was a scientist, and
yes,
and many of our conversations were laced with scientific inquiries, which were quite fascinating because this was a whole new arena for me, and one that was exciting to dance in because the questions, of course, were numerous on my part. But in the back of my mind, there was always the question of, well, is this art, and where is the art in this, and how or should this be translated as an art topic, and why? So my mind was always preoccupied about that, because I was indeed fascinated by the concept at the time. The concept of merging art and science was a relatively new one. And so I was very, very occupied with fleshing out these kinds of questions to make sure that my inquiries land on something that would be interesting as an artwork. Because if you were to just talk about the science in it in art, it becomes an illustration of science,
I agree,
like a biological illustration, which you can do in nuanced ways to depict all the feathers on the bird and all the different colors and how the beak is shaped and all of this sort of thing, which is done in perpetuity by the scientists who are interested in making it very precise and exact. But as an artwork, it would not succeed.
Well, I agreed, and it's we won't deviate too far from the sound. And I've had many late night conversations with Seth, as you know, at your place up up in Rhode Island and talking about science. And, Seth would always answer, and he very obviously, he's a doctor, right? I mean, in terms of, so he'd always like, oh no, that's the chronosynclastic infundibulum of the thing. Thanks, Seth. Appreciate that. Yeah. Meanwhile, I'm talking about, third grade level something or other. But yeah, I mean, so art in general, right? I was just at the Met the other day, and you could see the transformation at the Met, which is like going from old style painting, which is more scientifically based, in that the kind of the purpose of art in those days was to capture life, right? So the better the painter was in real life, the better that he was considered or she was considered an artist, right? And then of course the camera comes along in mid 19th century, and all of a sudden art has an existential crisis. What am I doing as an artist, right? I don't have to paint like that because photography is going to do it better. Thus we create modern art. And they also, though, walk that tightrope between science and art in a certain way. A slow start between changing from, and you could see it in Manet, you could see it in Renoir, you could see it in those the Impressionists, how they're really walking away from the science for science aspect of it into the art for art's sake aspect of it. But we still have those issues. There are scientific artists that many of them still to this day, and I see in many issues, not just science, by the way, an artist who's dealing with the environment. Fantastic, wonderful, great message, right? But on the other hand, as an art, at what point is there art just about the environment, and what part is it art? Where do you separate those two? How do you separate the oil from the vinegar? You know what I mean? Or do you even have to? But these are questions we pose.
And also,
sound,
message-related art.
Exactly, definitely message-related art. And sound is even more so, because we think of art, or the world thinks of art, maybe humanity thinks of art still as dating back to like Neolithic Lascaux, cave paintings in France, right? From 5,000 years ago or more. But, sound is art, right? I mean, it is. And so it's even more nebulous for people, for us to say, like, if I'm doing a sound piece, and I'm not a sound artist, I'm just an artist, right? I do visual, as I said. But if I'm doing a sound piece, it's even more nebulous to try to figure out where's the art in that, what part's the technology, what part is the poetry, what part is this, what part is that. And I'm even struggling right now with that piece that I mentioned, the Eternal Return. I'm struggling with, like, where's the art? And in the music aspect of my life, it's much easier, because in that aspect, and I'm not a musician, I'm just saying, I'm my wife's a musician, and I'm very heavily involved in their band and their group, and we own a recording studio and a publishing house. But the thing is, that's easier, because that's like not mainstream per se, but more like in that direction. We're not always questioning who and what we are, and that is much easier to establish, the way Pink Floyd or the Beatles, like we talked about, or whomever the band is, XTC. They know what they're doing. Artists, we don't know what the hell we're doing. We just don't know what we're doing.
Until after we've done it.
And even then we don't know, right? And I look back at the days when going through a museum like the Metropolitan, like, oh my God, it was so easy in those days. You brought your canvas out, you painted, and that was it. Now we have to think, geez, what does canvas mean? You start questioning like every aspect as a conceptual artist. Who am I? What am I? What does it mean if I staple that? That
what
kind of thing.
What is the point of the thread?
Exactly. That's where we are in art right now.
And then the molecules inside of the thread.
I remember, with Seth, going back to Seth, he was a big Monty Python fan. He had given me some, like, I remember I was traveling years ago, and before you can get internet everywhere, and he gave me these like DVDs of Monty Python, the whole everything of Monty Python. But one of my favorite ones is I think it's like this soccer game with the great philosophers, Socrates and Kant, and and they throw the Confucius, and it's a soccer game, and they're the players, and they throw the ball into the middle of the soccer match, and all the philosophers are just walking around like stroking their beards. What does that mean? What's the ball? And somebody yells Eureka, and he kicks the ball into the goal, right? Sometimes as an artist, you just got to kick the ball in the goal. We think too much like what the ball's about, right? But so to go to deep listening again, since I knew I was doing this interview with you, I became more acutely aware for the past 2 weeks since we've talked about this date today of really consciously listening to where I am at any given time. These sounds that establish where I am, the subway sound of the subway kicking up as it starts to pull away, the sound of the bird in the morning. When you're living your life constantly, like in New York and Woodstock, which is the majority of my life, you kind of, like I said, you get jaded to that, right? Deaf to it. You get a little deaf to it, hard of hearing, I would say. When I do travel, which is extensively, I'm much more in tune to the dialect of the Italian where I am, or I lived in Finland for a while, and I've lived in Kaohsiung, Taiwan, and China, and Hong Kong, and all these places, and residency programs. You're more acutely aware of that because you're constantly your ears are perked up to listen to the different sounds of the cars and the different sounds of the buses and the languages. And I find myself much more acutely aware if I'm traveling somewhere new. All my senses are, there's an XTC song called Senses Working Overtime. And my senses are working overtime when I travel, including my ears, the sound, hearing is working overtime too. I guess the idea would be to try to keep our lives working overtime in every aspect of our lives here, even when we're not traveling, even when I'm in Brooklyn, or even when I'm in Woodstock, or wherever I am always. To keep my ears open for everything.
Yeah. And that's, I think, one of the things that people struggle with when I talk to them about listening is because we are primarily visual creatures. Our sight is our dominant sense. And most of our world is filtered through our eyes and our visual perception in a very dramatic way. And I find that what I have to do is tell people to first close their eyes in order for them to focus on their ears. Because
I agree. I agree completely.
Because we've lived our lives dependent on our eyes, and our eyes lead us to places. Our eyes turn when our body turns to turn a corner, for example, or when the window shade is opened, our eyes follow the light and our heads move upwards to look at the sky, to look at the source of light. So we have been programmed and driven from the time we're born to respond to our visual world and think of it as the dominant sense. And it's and speaking about that, it's only very recently that NASA had actually decided to put a microphone on one of their latest search vehicles.
After 50 years.
More than, I think it was close to 60 years. It was only about exactly. 5 years ago.
It's crazy.
It was
crazy.
Perseverance, which was the very first vehicle that they put a microphone on. But that's an example of how our focus on the visual world dominates how we design our world.
Yeah, I'm thinking, as we're speaking, my window's open here in Brooklyn, in Greenpoint, and trucks are going by. Things are, I don't know if you pick it up on the microphone as we're speaking here, but it's like, that's just kind of there in the background, right? I've got a little fan in the window. It's too early to put air conditioner in, I thought, I've got the window open, and I'm just talking to you. But if my lights were flashing on and off and things were as staccato visually as they are audibly right now, I'd be freaking out. I'd have to ask, I'm trying to blow, I have to stop because my lights are flashing. I have to figure out what's happening, right? So, but audio is just, it's just people smashing things outside. It's no big deal. It's just in our background, you know? So there is this heavy duty difference in perception between visual and audio. It just is, you know? Unless, you know, somebody's challenged to put a blindfold on somebody, put them on the subway and say, make your way to Times Square. And then I think you'd be acutely aware of, you know, touch and of course the sounds of the subway, the sounds of the people around you, you know, that would heighten your experience with sound to do that.
Well, and
And
it's not that it's in the background, but it's only in the background because our eyes are in the foreground. If you were
exactly,
if you
exactly.
were to close your eyes and just listen to the world around you, it's a fantastic exercise to realize that you are surrounded with sounds, and it's not just a cacophony. If you pay close attention, you'll hear from your right ear sounds that are very different than that are entering your body than through the left ear, and front versus back. Sounds give you a sense of space, and how things unfold around you acoustically. So it gives us information about our world and where we stand, and when we move through it, how it changes, and how and the sounds influence the sort of. I was thinking of color. They create a color that fluxes and changes as we move through our lives. And if one should close their eyes, you would become more attuned to what is going on. And it brings up to me a walk that I went on rather recently with a friend of mine, and it was in the early morning hours, and the birds were starting to chirp, and I was
Mm-hmm.
hearing this out of one ear. A bird in the far right hand field was going on and on and on and on and on. He was just very actively chirping. And then every few chirps, there was this guy on the left hand side that would add. So sounded like to me like a dialogue. And
Right, exactly, right.
and it was just a constant thing that the guy on the right would be going on and on and on, and then the one on the left, his repetition was a little bit slower, but it created this a stereo effect that was quite
Yeah.
fascinating. But of course, it could have been the fact that we were just walking through the woods and they were warning everybody else that there are humans here. So
Yeah, I hear it with the chipmunks in Woodstock. They warn when there's a danger, and I know the sound of them now because I've had the
yeah,
house up there for 30 years in Woodstock.
yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. So they're communicating
I,
also. So the question would be, would they be chirping if we were not there? It's sort of the question of what is
right.
the sound of a tree falling in the woods if you were not there?
If a bird chirps in the woods, do you hear it if
Do you hear it?
nobody's there?
Right.
Exactly. But no,
Well, actually,
it's funny because
would the bird be chirping in the woods if you were not there?
exactly, exactly. So, I remember, you know, it's funny though, the absence of sound also is jarring, right? So I can think of two times that you're acutely aware of sound and you don't realize it. One is when I've tried to record things outdoors, let's say for a conversation like this or a video that I'm working on as a art piece, you don't realize how much ambient noise you pick up. You pick up the sound of a plane flying, you know, 30,000 feet high and 2 miles away. You don't realize it's even there. But when you play these things back, you hear the cars way in the distance. You hear the birds. You hear this. You hear that. Things that are just like kind of overlooked, not visually, but overlooked audibly. And when I'm recording like that, I'm like, oh my God, there's ambient noise around me constantly that I'm only aware of, like if I'm doing a project trying to isolate a voice, like we're isolating our voices now. And then the other time, not to get too introspective and morbid with this, but I remember you were here during 9/11, and and I remember how the city became quiet for the first time in my entire life. I had never heard
Yeah.
No sounds coming from New York City. No planes, no buses, no nothing.
People
Complete
just
and utter
stopped.
silence for days and days and days and days and days on end.
People
It,
just
it was
stopped in their
surreal,
tracks.
surreal the silence. To me, obviously, everything about it was jarring and everything about it was horrific, every single aspect of it. But that was one of the horrific aspects of it, the silence of New York City. No sound at all. I didn't even know where I was. It completely threw me off. And as you know, where you lived in Brooklyn and where I live in Brooklyn, I saw the towers come down. I could see it visually right out my window. And then after that is the silence. And it was as jarring as the visuals and as the realization of what actually happened that day. So silence and sound plays a very huge part of our lives, and listening does, you know? Um, and that was thrust upon us audibly, I'm talking about. Um, it's interesting to actively try to pursue that deep listening that you're talking about. And as I mentioned, since I knew about this, I've been trying to deep listen around me, in my home, in my loft where I live, in my on the street, everywhere I am, to just understand like what role that plays in my life. So it's been a very interesting, uh, what's the word I'm looking for, uh, exercise in the deep listening right now. Yeah, and fascinating as well.
Have and how long have you intently been practicing this?
Well, I mean, you and I have talked about deep listening now for a long time since you've been involved. So it's always been there since our art conversations, right? It's always been there um, since you really got involved with the deep listening concept. But really, since we kind of scheduled this, and it wasn't as if I said, "Well, let me start deep listening right now." It wasn't
Sure,
like that. It
sure.
was more like well, now I'm really aware of it. You know,
Uh huh.
it's like when you buy a red car and then you start seeing other red cars on the highway. It's like, oh, there's another red car because I have one. That's what it was like. That phenomenon, the red car phenomenon. It was listening instead. Um,
So I'm,
and
I'm
and Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'm just curious if you've found that, like the red car, it's led to, besides leading you to other red cars, if uh, if the close listening or deep listening has triggered any new concepts or directions or ideas for you.
Yeah, it brings me kind of full circle. I remember back probably around actually longer than when we met a long time ago, but it was before that. I had been doing these probably 5 or 6 years, just these kind of like listening tapes, which I still have. I would just go back then. It was done with a cassette. I would go in with a mini cassette player into a restaurant or go in and places I was traveling to, Toronto, Paris, London, and just record like an hour of just background noise. And it wasn't for anything, and I probably have 100 of them or more. It wasn't for anything. It was just kind of like, oh, this is an art piece on its own. It wasn't like I was trying to change anything or do anything. And the deep listening has brought me back like 35 years to that piece, believe it or not. This it's a briefcase like the Blues Brothers briefcase full of blues. Mine's a briefcase full of tapes of sounds. There's Paris in there, there's London in there, there's Dover, and uh, all the places, Venice I've been traveling to, and so what I've captured is this briefcase full of, like, instead of photographs or videos, it's just a briefcase full of sounds of places, and it has brought me back to that. And I remember when I was doing those pieces, for that full hour of taping or whatever it was, I would listen to everything around me, like just acutely aware of every spoon that was moved in a coffee shop or something. And that's so it has brought me back to those days a bit, full circle on that. It's good, very, very good.
It's almost like a sonic diary.
It is actually very well done. Yeah, I like that.
It sort of
Um,
establishes where you were at that particular moment in time and what you were experiencing.
it's exact intently on that. We get that in other things, by happenstance. You're doing a video of somebody and it comes in, but this was like the intent purpose was just that. Both sides of the tape, you know, and then leave. And I would do it everywhere I went for probably a year. I would say I have that, a
Wow.
full year's worth of that. Yeah,
Wow.
on cassette. It'd be good to digitize it and see what happens. Actually, um, yeah. So I
I'm
mean, and
curious.
you
Go ahead.
no, go ahead. You please tell me.
Oh, I was just going to say I'm curious to hear what your perception is now, 30 some odd years later, if you were to listen back in onto some of those tapes, what your perception would be of them now.
Right, we probably hear people talking at coffee shops instead of looking at their phone quietly. I bet you there's a lot of things that technology has changed, right? I mean, there TVs would sound differently, and I'm sure there are things that have changed, and I bet there's a lot of things that sound the same as well. So yes, it'd be interesting to hear them, you know, and they're from all over the place. They're from small town I grew up in. I did a bunch of those, and I did a bunch when I'd go back and visit. And like I said, from all over the world. So it'd be interesting to capture that and see what it sounds like. You know, but
Well,
yeah, I mean,
capture that
and
now and do it then and now.
it, it would be a then and now piece. Um, with sound work, I've included sound in a number of my pieces. And on the other hand, I did a symphony piece, a show that you and I were in together, where I did the symphony in total silence, the Mozart Eine kleine Nachtmusik piece in total silence. So the only thing in the room, it's just a video of the orchestra playing the piece completely silently. And that's also a sound piece, right? It's just a silent sound piece. It's just, but it is a sound piece, you know? So sound has always been super important to me. In fact, reality wise, I probably walked into art and I've had this realization. I probably realistically walked into art through music. I've always been a visual artist. My grandfather, when I was 4 years old, he was not an artist. He was a sailor who was in World War II. But he taught me to draw, you know, the ocean using like U's to create the water and seagulls making a V by spreading out the V and with magic markers just as a 4-year-old kid. And I've always been fascinated by art, but that was totally visual art. I was painting. I went to painting classes when I was 7. My parents brought me to these private painting classes, and but I'm talking conceptual art. I probably walked through the door of conceptual art. Yes, Jonathan Borofsky and yes, Kossuth and all the big players in the conceptual game. But I bet you, like I mentioned, Pink Floyd or the Beatles or conceptual albums, Tommy the Who, and I bet you they probably did more for my realization of conceptual art originally than anybody else. When you think about Dark Side of the Moon or you think about Animals as a concept album, that's a true work of art. That's not just an album, it's a work of art. It actually is a conceptual piece of art. The Wall, let's say, or the White Album, as we mentioned, Sgt. Pepper's. You know, I'm not saying they hold up to a Kossuth piece. I'm not saying they're Jonathan Borofsky's Counting to Infinity work. But what I'm saying is they played a vital role for me as an introduction into the mind expanding ideas of sound art and visual art. They were an important part of my life to listen to those things for me. You know, yeah. So I've been recently thinking about that.
That's really fascinating to hear how your childhood music experiences have colored your approach to art.
Yeah, and crazy part is I look back to like a piece I did in those painting classes, probably around 12 or 13 at this time, and then a piece I did in high school, and I'm like, Jesus, my work hasn't changed all that much. It's just gotten, I'm just better at it. You know what I mean? Like the underlying, nucleus of it is still kind of similar. back then I just did this. I was probably 15 or something. I did this kind of mountain, very surrealistic Dali type of mountain with people on it, and I did a quote from "Wish You Were Here." And I'm 15 years old. I'm like, oh, geez, 40 years later, I'm still like, basically doing the same thing. I'm just better at it. I could talk the talk a little bit more, than I could back then. Yeah. So oodles of theory now instead of just, drawing from Wish You Were Here. But basically, it's all the same. It just is.
Well, that's nice to know that there's this thread that is a continuum from then until now. It's not. It's great, if you stay on the same path for a long period of time, you become so practiced in your field that you pursue, and of course, hopefully we all get better. But it's kind of, I don't know. I guess it's reassuring, in a way, to know that one could have a thread that starts, very, very young, and you pull it throughout your life, and you can touch it as a touching point throughout your life, and use it as
like a touchstone,
as a base point or a touchstone for your next steps. So that's kind of sweet to know that it is possible for a life. I don't know if everybody has that. I'm not sure if I do. I would have to think closely about it.
I'm not even sure I do.
But you just identified one thread. I mean, maybe we have a whole wharf and weft of threads that we can pull on.
Exactly.
But you've identified one that's a sort of a dominant color or a dominant thread that is playing in your world.
Done,
yeah.
Yeah, well done. And it is that way. And it's through that introspection that I'm able to think that way, right? Generally, we're not like that. Generally, we're just pushing forward like a freight train as an artist, knocking cows out of the way, right? That are on the tracks. But sometimes the train stops and you have to think about, how many cows you knocked out of the way, right? And this is like one of the cows.
Or do the cows matter?
Oh, wow. Cows matter. I'm a vegetarian. So anyway, but but yeah, I mean, I look back and I'm always thinking I'm reinventing myself, right? I wake up every day like I'm reinventing myself every day, but of course that's not true at all, I mean, it's dyed in our wool of these things. It just is, where we came from and what we're doing, and no matter what we do, it kind of circles back into that thread, as you say. It just does, gets woven back into everything we do. It is. But, the sound work, though, I find interesting. And I have probably 10 or 20 more ideas for sound that I haven't pulled the trigger on yet for various reasons, right? And I'm really love the idea of working in sound, though, along with my other stuff, right? And the idea for me is also try to minimalize everything. So we're just getting the basis of the sound and not too much more attached to it. That's always a difficult problem in art, as you know that. At what point do I take everything away and still be left with something that's interesting and good? And, and that's how I am as an artist. Yeah, it's difficult problem.
I often ask myself, am I over-editing?
Exactly. Or under editing, right?
Have I gone past or I stopped too soon?
Exactly. Or I went too far. I've had pieces where I've gone too far, and I've gone too far in building them, right? And I'm like, oh, and then I've had pieces where I've gone too far in editing down to nothing. And then you have to try to pull it back and say, oh my God, I forgot to, I forgot to add the paint on that canvas or something like that. I'm like, okay, I stripped everything away except the stretcher bars, to use the painting metaphor.
And then you're whittling at the stretcher bars.
Exactly, carving a little design, which I've done. So let's not joke about that. So, this is great.
I've been there. Well, there's we have a few more minutes, actually a little bit more than a few more minutes. And so I'm
Okay.
just I'm curious. You have mentioned a couple of times talking about how your focus on sound has triggered a number of ideas for new works that have not been yet realized. So, if we could sort of go back a little bit further, I'm curious about how what has created this intense interest of uh, escorting sound into your art, or escorting art with your sound. Maybe it's that version.
I I think I think it's always been there. As I mentioned, if I go back to high school with that "Wish You Were Here" piece that I did at 15, that's sound oriented. It just is because it came across. The vehicle was sound that brought the concept along with it, right? And so, and then fast forward a few years, and I'm doing all these sound pieces that I'm taping wherever I travel on cassette, which isn't that far away from that. So I think sound has always been a part of my work. It's a big part of my life. Music's a big part of my life, and sound is, and ideas are, reading is also. And I think it's just always been there. And I've done a number of sound works, as you know. I've done a couple with you, actually. We've done a couple together, and great ones. I actually love the things that we've done together. Our sound work, and "Why Do Gorillas Have Big Nostrils" is
Oh,
like
that was
a piece
great.
that you and I did. I loved it
It
actually,
was a
and
nice collaborative work where each person,
at,
there were four of us, and each person contributed a line. And it
well,
was,
that actually, that Gorillas is just you and me. The other
oh,
one
that's
is
right.
with David Updike and Susan
And
Dion.
Susan Dion.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
was. Yeah. Oh, I forget the name of that. One was Radio Moscow, I think, that we did,
Yeah.
the four
Yeah.
of
That
us.
was Radio Moscow.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, but I loved doing the collaborative work with sound too. But I think, again, I'm always the conundrum for me is like how to present it, right? That's always the conundrum for me. And it's not a bad conundrum. It's just a conundrum, like to take into account. If you know you're doing a painting, you put it on the wall. Sometimes you put it on the floor to really change things up, or put it on the ceiling. But mostly it goes on the wall. Those are kind of given. Sculpture goes on the floor, or maybe you mount it on the wall. But sound is like, well, what do I do? Do I bury the speakers? Is it just a sound piece? Is it an empty room? Is it do I build the speakers? Do I bring in a Bang Olufsen speaker system so that they become a sculptural part of the aspect of the work?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
these are considerations we need to do with sound. What are you selling? Are you selling the sound? Or are you selling the Bang & Olufsen stereo system? It's hard to know what in terms you're doing, right?
And considering that, one has to consider how it fits as a visual form in the visual art realm.
Exactly, exactly. And I'm more a lot of times as an artist, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead kind of guy. Like I don't care sometimes, and then other times I do care about it. Um, and that's the thing I'm not quite sure about. But the sound pieces to me are important, and I'm surrounding, as I'm always surrounding myself with people. I've done sound pieces at Sugar Hill Studios in Houston, Texas, when did a show at Project Row Houses. At that time, it was owned by Beyonce, and I'm involved. I've been up to Utopia Studios many times with Pete. Now took it over up in Woodstock. So I've worked out of these studios, and I love the environment of the actual creating of the sound piece. And now it's a question of how to display some of these things, but that's part of our job as an artist, is to figure that out.
Right,
So
right. And
yeah,
I was thinking
yeah,
about, if we go back a few steps, I was just reflecting on the fact that since I've known you all these umpteen years,
yeah.
one of the dominant characteristics of your work that I think stands out is that you have a interest in, or a taste for, narrative.
There's a lot of narrative in my work. Yeah,
And I th- and
not
I
not long narrative,
no
but
no
short
no no
narrative.
no no.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah.
sort of
but definitely narrative, no question.
Telling not necessarily literal story, sometimes literal, but telling a particular story.
Absolutely.
And I think that I suspect that might have to do a lot with your. I believe you had said to me once how your mother used to read a lot to you, and how reading plays an important part in your life because of her influences and in telling stories from the book.
Yeah, well, so I don't remember her reading to me, but we read a lot so I remember one of my earliest memories is going to the Tompkins Cove Library with my mom, and we'd go every week, and she was a voracious reader, and I still am. I'm constantly, every day of my life, I set aside an hour to read every single day, and I'm constantly reading. I have been since I was 4 years old. And we learned to read young, and I've literally been going to the library since that time. So she taught us to read, and taught us to love books, and it is a huge part of my life. Narrative stories, literature, I surround myself with that constantly. Still do to this day. I live in a loft, and 1/3 of my loft is just taken up with books. It just is,
Yeah.
And I've been collecting books, and one of my rule is whatever book I collect, I have to read. Have that rule for the past 40 years of my life.
Well, yep. I can see that this touches on a new topic of acoustic narrative that we can speak on for another hour.
Exactly. Another 5 hours.
Well, right, exactly. So, but since our hour is pretty much over with, I just wanted to ask you if there's anything else you wanted to add, or if there's anything in the near future you want to talk about.
No, I think that we've surrounded a lot in this hour. Yes, you and I, we've done it before. We could talk for the next 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hours, but I think that we've surrounded this, and yeah, I mean, for me as an artist, I'm at the point of creating right now. I do have a couple things coming up, one in Italy, and the other, I believe, in Germany, and so there's always something happening, and I'll be spending my time now between Brooklyn and Woodstock again. So I will see you in Woodstock, I'm sure, very soon.
Wonderful, Richard Humann. Thank you so much for this great interview.
China Blue, thank you.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of Listening with China Blue. I hope it inspires you to build your own listening practice. This begins as a daily practice of attentively listening without judgment. And you can ask yourself, what is your own version of silence? The music for this podcast is from China Blue's Saturn Walk, co-composed with Lance Massey, the creator of the T-Mobile ringtone. If you want to learn more about me and my work, go to chinablueart.com. And also, please follow me on Facebook at china.blue.art, at Instagram at china_blue_art, and on X at China Blue Art.